You're listening to the Creative Process Podcast. Here you will discover what drives musicians to create music and how they realize that ambition. I'm your host, Jamie Collin, founder of the online independent music magazine, Overblown. On the surface, Pennsylvania's Rosetta are a post-metal band. However, over the course of 6 albums, they have incorporated elements of post-hardcore, shoegaze, drone, post-rock, avant-garde and ambient music into their expansive sound. The group have just released their most recent record, Utopioid. Delving into areas that are more atmospheric and melodic than the group's previous work, it also displays the band's intrinsic need to develop. I spoke to Matt Weed, guitarist and vocalist with Rosetta, about what exactly the band does during their 10-hour marathon writing sessions, how they arrange music before composing it, and the influence of LucasArts point-and-click games on his musical development. You know, I read an interview you did with Arctic Drones recently where you were talking about working on quintessential ephemera. Mm-hmm. And you're saying you're doing these like 10-hour sessions at the weekend with Eric while you'd be writing the record. Yeah. I was actually, when I read that, I like, my first thought was like, what did those 10-hour sessions actually consist of?
It's funny. A lot of it is conversation. And when I say conversation, I don't mean just us sitting around and talking about whatever, although obviously that is a certain part of it because you can't keep up your focus for that insane length of time. But one of the shifts that was already beginning to happen before Eric joined the band was that we were beginning our writing process with conversation rather than beginning it by playing our instruments and seeing what came out.
What kind of conversations were you having?
I mean, it was just a process where we'd bring ideas to each other, but we wouldn't bring them as, here, let me play this for you on my instrument and see what you think of it. It was, I have an idea for a song and let me describe it to you verbally. It wasn't a case of like, I have written this sequence of notes or I have written this chord progression and I want you to comment on it and see if we can work it into something. It would be, I have an idea for a song and this is the feeling that I would like the song to convey. And I think that maybe it could have a part at the beginning that's really choppy, and then that can segue into a part that has a more legato feel.
That sounds interesting to me because it's kind of like arranging the music before you actually have the music.
So it begins with the end in mind, where you're kind of already thinking about, this is the feeling that I would like to be communicated in this piece of music. And that's well before you write lyrics. So there's not a sense of it being about a topic or anything like that. It's more just, hey, I think that maybe we should write a more aggressive song, or hey, I'm thinking maybe we can write something that has a melodic and upbeat feel to it, and maybe it has a little bit of a frantic beat and pace to it, and maybe we can have this time change in it, or maybe we can have this, we'll draw out dynamic maps of a song sometimes before they're even written, where we're like, let's have a really loud part where then it comes down and it goes back up and then it drops down to almost nothing, that sort of stuff. So it was beginning with this kind of verbal communication. And when we started that, we didn't really know how to do it. So it was awkward and it would take forever, but we had already been in that by the time we added Eric to the band. So with the quintessential process, it was just kind of sit around on the floor of the practice space and be batting around. It would be a discussion because people would have, counter ideas that they'd like to throw out, and we would hash out almost in a committee fashion what we wanted to do with a song before we even really started writing the progressions and the notes for it.
And is that how you wrote the new record, Utopioid?
Essentially, but I think it was more disciplined and it was more developed, because with Utopioid, rather than having that process happen individually for each song, that process was this much longer arc of conversation that was happening for the entire album. And so we actually had an outline of the flow of the album, the sort of dynamic and chromatic flow of the album, before we really even wrote anything. I think the song Day Tent, track 6, was the only song that already had a framework ready to go by the time we started talking about the album concept. So it was a weird way of, we were writing on a flip chart and trying to outline, we'd like for this whole album to have 4 parts, have a kind of symphonic structure to it. And we'd like for each of these 4 parts to map to different 4-part metaphysical concepts like cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, or the 4 seasons, and kind of have those things merge and blend a little bit and be related to stages in a life cycle. We knew we wanted to have a main narrative protagonist. We knew that we wanted the album to be kind of performed from this first person protagonist perspective. And so there was all this conceptual stuff that was in there. And then we kind of created an outline of the whole album. And then we would say, okay, we need to write a song for part one. So from the outline of the album, there would be all of these different parameters. Okay, part one of the album, we'd like to have a kind of shimmering and bright feeling to it. And let's select our keys and our instrumentation and just the sort of the textures and tempos and all these things based on that framework and what part of the album we're writing for. And we would actually have whole weekends where we would say, okay, we're going to concentrate on part two of the album this weekend, or we're going to concentrate on part four this weekend. And we would show up with different instruments depending on what it was that we were going to work on for a given time frame.
Sounds quite disciplined and quite organized, definite way of writing music. Like, I mean, some musicians I've talked to, I thought that they'd be more disciplined, to be honest. You know?
Okay.
Because I used to write music when I was younger, when I was maybe 10, 15 years ago, when I was in my late teens, you know? And I could never get like a really completed song finished. And I think it was because I just didn't have the discipline. So I presumed when I started talking to musicians that they'd be a lot more disciplined than me. But some of them just say it's like wading through crap.
Yeah. But, and it was definitely like that for us for the first few albums. Like early on, that was very much the feeling of it. And I guess I'm kind of surprised that it's changed because I don't know, it seems you get entrenched in patterns of behavior over time. And I think we consciously developed a different working method because we wanted to make different sounds. And we felt like we weren't going to be able to make different sounds if we kept writing songs the same way.
It's as if the creative process is a dark room and you've kind of figured out to put on the light, or at least at least have the lights up a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes when talking to musicians, it sounds like they're literally fumbling around in the dark, but somehow find the door on the other side. Yeah. Like, is it sheer luck? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think there's an attraction to that kind of process because when you write via improvisation, I think there's a special kind of sudden joy that you get to experience when you discover something really great. And maybe it took a lot of bumbling around to get there, but when you have that epiphany moment, it's really, really rewarding and it's really, really exciting. And then it's like every time you play that song in the future, you get to kind of re-experience that in a small way over and over and over. And it is kind of magical. And I think the feeling of it being magic, even though it's, really just subconscious, is pretty cool. And I can understand why people would stick with that. I mean, I think the trade-off of moving towards something that's more illuminated, as you're saying, is it's a harsh light sometimes. It's vulnerable. Like you have to go back and forth with people, and you have to be willing to subject every little detail of your ideas to scrutiny, and you can't be territorial and you can't be protective about the stuff that you're coming up with, because I think that everybody does better work in collaboration, and that's a painful process, but I think ultimately it produces a better product.
I think it certainly has benefits, because imagine there'd be a risk, say if the band had one primary songwriter, of a quality control issue. If there was nobody there to say, no, Matt, that's not very good. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, I'm always talking about trade-offs, and I think a democratic working process has a zillion trade-offs. But that's the thing, is that, I don't know, I guess when I think about the sort of solo songwriter process, really the only benefit in my mind that has is speed. It's like if you're not doing better work in collaboration than you're able to do on your own, it's probably because you have the wrong collaborators, not so much because there's actually something inhibiting about collaboration. I just think everybody is capable of better things when they're working with other people.
I've seen the word Utopioid used in relation to architecture. And when I Googled it, I saw someone claim that it meant nowhere person, but I didn't see a whole lot online about it. And I was wondering, where did you find the title? Or
actually, well, it came up in one of those conversations where we were talking about the concept. I think I have always liked, the portmanteau smashing two words together that share a vowel sound or something like that. I'm always trying to think of new portmanteau, and that was one that popped into my head. And I guess it was originally just the working title of the album, and we kind of thought that it was too informal or silly or off the wall to make it the real title. But after a while, honestly, it just stuck. For us, the salient aspect was just that it's merging the words utopia and opioid. Particularly in the United States right now, it's just everybody knows somebody who has been touched by the opioid addiction epidemic. It's everywhere, and it affects people at all different levels of class and income, and in different geographic locations and different social status. It just seems to cut across all of these different boundaries. And this sort of conventional wisdom, the kind of pundit explanation for why we're we're experiencing this in the US right now is just an overwhelming sense of hopelessness or irrelevance. I guess my spin on that is that I struggled with a bout of pretty severe anxiety over the last cycle, and I was having some medical problems related to that at the same time. And what stuck out to me about all of that was that people just need something to look forward to. When you get to a point where you don't have anything to look forward to, you will go get something to look forward to, even if that something is going to kill you in pretty short order in most cases. And I think the sense of those two words being together, the utopia that is promised doesn't materialize. And so then the opioid comes in to take its place, kind of. And that just felt like the way, maybe the best or the most succinct way to describe the arc of the album, and kind of the way that it moves from this sense of vibrance, new life, and optimism into all these different realizations of culpability and disappointment, and a sense of kind of learning that you have a responsibility to the other after it's too late, that sort of thing. And I think I have read about and have been aware of through friendships a number of cases where people had an issue where they were addicted to some substance or other, opioids in a couple of cases, and successfully beat that addiction, got off of it. And then after they came out the other end of that process, kind of like, well, why did I spend all this effort and time to beat that when still just as messed up as it was before? And my relationships are still as dysfunctional as they were before. And kind of like, what is there left when you've gone through all of that? And you're just kind of like, well, life still is just as bad as it was before. And I don't have an answer for that. I don't know what to do with that. But we were trying to explore that kind of existential despair a little bit on the back half of the album.
I personally feel that, life is trying to come to terms with that existential despair that's probably in everyone. This kind of like this hole that you're constantly trying to fill, and coming to terms with the fact that it exists and that's okay is probably kind of the nearly the meaning of life. Yeah,
I mean, the sense of acceptance, and I don't know, I don't know if I'm there yet. I think I'm still battling that. I guess like maybe one possible assumption when people hear the album is that we're dealing with some sort of personal crisis that's related to drug addiction or something along those lines, but that's not actually the case. Like I've never struggled with something like that, but I see myself in the stories of people who have had that struggle, and especially over this last year as I've been dealing with anxiety and mental and physical health issues, and just kind of like, I guess, encountering what it means to be an aging person for the first time in my life, because I'm in my mid-30s now and things are changing and I kind of don't know what to do about that. And all of these strange things begin to happen to you, and, prompts all of this additional reflection or whatever. It just seems like it's all tied together. And that was, again, returning to the issue of vulnerability, having to talk about that with the bandmates and just kind of being like, yeah, I don't feel the same way that I used to, and I don't like that, was pretty uncomfortable. But I think that we were able to do a lot of processing via creating music that was really helpful for us individually, not to mention the fact that I think we were able to make an album that we were proud of.
It sounds like it was nearly cathartic or like a therapy for you.
Yeah, at least for me it was. I think it's to varying extents with the other guys because they're all having different things going on in their lives. But for me personally, absolutely.
I know at this stage as well, you operate more or less independently. So how does that affect your creative process?
I think it does affect it, but the effect is more administrative or logistical than anything else. We're not tied to a label's release schedule or anything like that. We can basically decide when we want to release music. And I think we're still learning the ropes in terms of the business and marketing side of that, where we're trying to figure out, when is the best time of year for us to release music, things like that. But I always appreciate being able to just kind of finish up some tours and say, okay, it's time to write an album. Let's not take any tours during this block. Let's figure out when we're going to get together, do all that sort of stuff. And then basically we can just assume that when it's ready, we can release it. And we don't have to worry about any other considerations.
I must say, from my point of view, it's very nice to just go onto Facebook and find you're looking for contact information and you just get to contact the band. No middleman. This is great.
Yeah.
I was delighted.
Yeah. We don't have a manager and we never have. It's always been a thing. I mean, it's hard to keep up with sometimes. Like obviously the band email account gets a lot of email, but we actually try to read and respond to everything that comes through there.
I was wondering as well, have you heard of Patreon?
The subscription and crowdfunding service.
Crowdfunding service, And I was wondering, or any kind of crowdfunding service. Would that be something you'd consider pursuing to finance projects in the future?
Maybe. Well, I guess the best way to say it is we wouldn't ever rule it out definitively, but I think we actually did Kickstarter one time in 2011. We had a major problem with our van, and we had to come up with money very, very quickly to be able to do a recording session that we had already booked. So we ended up doing Kickstarter for that. That was for a split with the band Junius. And that actually ended up working out really well. Like, people came through for us. We had enough money. We were able to do the recording. But then on the backside of it, the logistical and administrative challenges of fulfilling all the orders and communicating with everyone who had supported and all that stuff, it became a huge burden. And so just from an administrative perspective, I think we've always shied away from dealing with that. It just always felt easier to self-finance up front and then let people pay after the thing is out. And we haven't, I guess we might consider going to a crowdfunding model if we were consistently not making back our money, if we weren't able to recoup our expenses on production. But for the last 3 albums, we've actually been able to make back the expenses very, very quickly. So it really hasn't been an issue. And then we've just always been careful about putting aside money to make sure that there's money for the next recording when it comes time to do that. But I think also I have a little bit of discomfort with just the subscription model in general, kind of the idea that people are just sort of paying you regularly for whatever it is that you're going to release. Because I think I would feel a specific kind of creative pressure with a money stream like that might actually be inhibiting to some extent. Like, that's like, oh, I need to produce, I need to make something so that these people are happy and they feel like they're getting their money's worth. And I think that might stress me out to a point that it would be counterproductive.
Like a negative obligation, essentially.
Exactly, yeah.
I was just asking because, the crowdfunding is huge. Like, I mean, it's grown, so it's bigger than venture capital at this stage, or it will be in the next couple of years. It's just amazing how people are really, I think, coming around to the idea that if you want to have something that has substance, if you want to have something that's quality, you actually have to pay for it. I think it's been 10, 15 years of people being like, oh, download this, download that. That's great. When I was 15 and I first got Napster, I thought it was brilliant as well, But I think attitudes are changing because they've seen what's happened to mainstream music because of that.
Yeah, I know. I completely agree. And I think that, when we think about what pop music has become, just the sense that it's weaponized hooks, it's like they're using computer algorithms to figure out what's going to move the most copies. It's just pure distilled essence of marketing. There's not art in it anymore. And I think you're exactly right that people realize, like, art is life and I don't want to live without art. And if I don't want to live without art, it means I'm going to actually have to provide some resources for artists to make that art. And I think that's totally legit. So again, that's kind of why I say we would never rule out any one specific funding strategy. And I think no matter what strategy we use, we have this really, really deep trust in our listeners that they understand that principle that you're talking about, that, you do need to actually support and pay for something if you want it to be what you hope it'll be. And our listeners have totally come through for us on that count every time.
And that must be kind of extra rewarding as well, particularly when you kind of took a bit of a leap of faith initially.
Yeah, for sure. And it's, I don't know, like, criticism a lot of times tends to stick more than affirmation. But that's a thing that you can kind of fall back on. Like, the numbers don't lie. It doesn't matter really, what their little nitpicks or criticisms are of the final product. The reality is that they spent their money on it, and that's a deeply meaningful thing on its own.
I read as well that you're interested or involved with other creative pursuits like photography and art and film. In what manner are you involved with those?
Well, I actually went to school. I went to university for photography, video, and digital media. I mean, I had a few other topics of study tossed in there as well. But I kind of actually think that was something that my younger self did more of. I was really, really into photography for a long time, and specifically medium format film photography and darkroom printing and things like that. That's gotten a lot harder to do just because everything is digital now. But I actually think that one of the things that's come up as I've started to think about aging is that my focus has narrowed a little bit. There was a time where I kind of thought, like, between the members of the band, we can do everything. We can do all of the graphic design and the video and the photography and any of the stuff that the band could ever possibly need. Like, we can come up with that all on our own. And I don't really feel that way anymore. I'm kind of like, no, you know what? Let's farm this out to somebody who actually does it at a higher level than we're able to at our amateur level. And let's concentrate on making music. I still do those things for my own personal enjoyment, but I guess like what I've lost is the sense that I would ever be a person who is primarily about those things. It's just kind of something that I do for my own personal development, or just kind of nurturing the artistic part of myself, rather than it being something that has a kind of functional purpose to it the way that the music does. And I don't know, it just kind of actually made it a lot more fun and a lot more enjoyable to be able to think of those additional elements in a more informal way.
Another thing I was interested in actually was, I read about you had an interest in drone-based scores for independent video games. What was appealing about that?
So I haven't actually done that. I would love to do that. Part of it is that the music that I love most tends to be mostly instrumental drone music. Stars of the Lid is my favorite band of all time. And I really don't listen to very much heavy music or rock at home. The vast majority of what I listen to at home is ambient or drone. And I think I've always been a person who's maybe a little bit more interested in texture than in melody. Like, I love melody, and melody is obviously really important to the music that I write, but I've always been preoccupied with texture. And I've always kind of felt that texture can stand on its own. And I guess I was really, really, really into computer games in the late 90s. And I love point and click adventure games and these kind of video games that were primarily about narrative, and they were not about reflexes, and they were just like really atmospheric and interested in telling a story more than anything else. And I've kind of gotten back into that a little bit recently. I think there's some stuff coming out now. There's this game that I was really inspired by called Kentucky Route Zero. I loved what they did with the visuals and the sounds and the way that everything was calibrated to create this very, very specific atmosphere. And I guess there was a part of me that, as I was experiencing that, like, I don't even know if I could call it playing it. As I was experiencing that, I was thinking like, hey, I think I might be capable of making something like this. Not exactly like that, but the kind of sounds that I'm interested in making on a more informal basis could actually be a really good match for some type of digital entertainment that's a little bit more narrative and atmospheric than some of the big stuff.
It's interesting. I actually did love point and click adventure games when I was in the 90s as well. Things like, Day of the Tentacle. And,
loved that. Oh yeah.
That's a great one. Oh, I love that game. They did that remastered version recently the last few years and played it all again.
I bought it when it came out. Man. So fun. It's great stuff.
Game. I kind of like that era of games because it seemed a bit cowboyish. A couple of guys in their room making like seriously weird games.
Yeah,
and then I thought it became a bit more professional than maybe in the late 90s, early 90s, and point and click games kind of died off a bit. But now, because there's so many indie games, there's that kind of sense of exploration again.
Yeah, it's coming back, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I love that. I think it's maybe even more experimental now than it was in the 90s. And I wish I had more time to devote to that kind of stuff, because there's such amazing stories being told in that medium right now.
There was actually a soundtrack for something. What's the name? It's a point and click game, or is it called To the Moon? Do you know that one? Mm-hmm. A lovely soundtrack, actually. I really like that soundtrack, but it's very kind of 8-bit soundtrack.
And actually, funny that you mentioned the LucasArts stuff from the 90s, because I think I was actually really affected by the soundtrack to the game The Dig.
Oh, man, that's some game. Sorry.
It's amazing. And I guess like I read a little bit about how the music was created for that, and it's actually a bunch of samples from classical recordings of Wagner preludes. And the guy who did the score for the game took those samples from these Wagner recordings and mapped them to synthesizer patches so that he could just play the samples as though they were orchestral chords. And I had no idea about any of that stuff when I was 16 and playing that game, but I remember being deeply affected by that music and it kind of expanding my sense of what was possible for music to accompany a storytelling medium.
I also saw that you said that, the band largely pays for itself, but you don't individually make any money from it, which means getting a job or like that will make you financially comfortable is difficult, and you spend all your vacation time touring, and it takes a toll on kind of personal relationships. And I'm wondering, as you're going along, do you ever feel that like, is this worth it?
Yeah, all the time. It's funny. Thor Harris from Swans had this little blog post that he did one time, and it's like rules for touring or something like that. And the one that stuck out to all of us was this rule that said, never evaluate your life in a janitor's closet backstage. So this sense of like, there are appropriate times for healthy introspection and reflection about what are your priorities and what is your life about and that sort of thing. But, backstage at a horrible venue is not one of those places. A 14-hour plane ride is not one of those places. And so it's always there, but it needs to be managed a lot of time. And I guess, I don't know, we've been doing it for a long time and we're at a point where what we're doing is working reasonably well. So maybe it doesn't provoke quite as much anxiety as it used to. Everybody's anxious about money all the time. And we're definitely no exception to that. But the anxiety was significantly attenuated by the fact that we don't have to use our personal money for things like plane tickets or van rental or that type of thing. The fact that the band is able to take care of those expenses on its own is a huge load off. And so really the primary thing becomes time. Do I have enough time to do this tour? Can I get enough time off of work? Or in my case, since I'm self-employed, can I take enough time away from my wife and just kind of like our household situation, that kind of thing, from my family? I don't know. That never really goes away. But I guess as part of, the ways that I'm trying to be a more mature person, actually grow up a little bit and have a more nuanced perspective on life, I am trying to think about the fact that this thing that I do is important to a lot of people out there, that it's meaningful to people. It helps people, that kind of thing. And I don't want that to be a vanity thing. That's not something that I intentionally think about to pump myself up or to feel better about myself, so much as it's just trying to remember that the things that I do have consequences beyond myself. And actually my involvement in music, while it has some negative consequences in my own life, has a lot of positive consequences for other people's lives that I'm not really directly aware of necessarily. And that's worthwhile. Like, that's a good trade-off. I don't know. I guess, what good does it do anybody if I'm financially comfortable and totally not stressed out about anything, but I'm not contributing anything of significance to the world around me, or if I'm not making anybody else's life better?
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Creative Process Podcast. Make sure to check out the show notes in our podcast section at overblown.co.uk. Here you will find links to everything mentioned in this episode. Overblown and the Creative Process Podcast are both an entirely DIY venture. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can become a patron of Overblown at patreon.com/overblown. See you down the front.